Autumn 1914. Europe had already plunged into the abyss of war, but few imagined that the fate of entire empires would be decided in a Polish industrial city. Lodz, an unremarkable point on the map of the Eastern Front at first glance, suddenly became the epicenter of a clash of giants. Why? The answer lay in the steel threads that entangled Europe, the railways. He who controlled the rail lines controlled the war. Lodz became a key railway junction, connecting Warsaw with the German border and the Russian hinterland. For Germany, capturing the city meant a breakthrough to the heart of the Russian Empire. For Russia, holding the last barrier before the enemy's advance. For Poles, the transformation of their homeland into an arena for a foreign battle. The steel arteries, built for prosperity, now determined the routes of armies and supply lines. In a world where the speed of troop deployment decided the outcome of campaigns, the Lodz railways became the arteries of war. Their importance was understood by everyone, from generals in headquarters to ordinary soldiers in the trenches. Here, amidst the smoke of factory chimneys and the clatter of wagon wheels, the fate not only of the campaign, but of the entire war in the East was to be decided. By the beginning of November 1914, the map of the Eastern Front resembled a patchwork quilt of victories and defeats. The first months of the war had shattered illusions of a quick victory on both sides. Germany, embroiled in the exhausting Battle of the Marne in the west, faced unexpected activity from Russian troops in the east. The Russian Empire, despite a catastrophic defeat in East Prussia, managed to deliver a serious blow to the Austro-Hungarian armies in Galicia. The recently concluded Warsaw-Ivangorod operation marked the first major success for Russian arms. German troops, who had approached the outskirts of Warsaw in October, were pushed back to the borders of Silesia. The German plan for a lightning-fast defeat of Russia had failed. But the Russian command also failed to capitalize on its success. The Germans retreated in an organized manner, preserving the combat effectiveness of their units. Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, the supreme commander of the Russian army, understood that it was necessary to consolidate the advantage. The plans of the Russian staff were ambitious: to continue the offensive into Silesia, striking at the industrial heart of Germany. This required regrouping forces, bringing up reserves, and establishing supplies. The railways of Poland were operating at their limit, delivering reinforcements and ammunition to the front. But the German command was not idle either. General Erich Ludendorff, the de facto head of operations in the east, developed a daring plan for a counterattack. The German Ninth Army, under the command of General August von Mackensen, was secretly redeployed to the Torun area. From here, it was planned to launch a sudden flank attack on the Russian troops advancing into Silesia. The goal was not merely to stop the Russian offensive, but to encircle and destroy a significant portion of Russian forces in Poland. The Germans skillfully utilized their main advantage, a developed network of railways. In a matter of days, 5 army corps with artillery and supply trains were moved to new positions. Russian intelligence failed to detect these movements in time. Camouflage and disinformation worked flawlessly. German newspapers even printed false reports of troops being transferred to the west. Meanwhile, Russian troops were stretched out along a vast front from the Baltic to the Carpathians. The 1st, 2nd, 5th, and 4th armies of the Northwestern Front occupied positions in Poland. Their communications were stretched, and coordination between units left much to be desired. The right flank of the Russian troops proved particularly vulnerable, where a gap had formed between the 1st and 2nd armies. It was precisely here, into the gap between the Russian armies, that Mackensen planned to strike. His target was Lodz, a key transport hub controlling railway communication between Warsaw and the central regions of Poland. The capture of the city would allow the Germans to cut through the Russian front and create a threat of encirclement for several armies at once. In early November, Lodz was in an anxious but relatively calm mood. The German retreat after the Warsaw-Ivangorod operation instilled hope that the front line would move further west. City authorities tried to restore normal life, despite the influx of refugees and wounded. No one suspected that the city would soon become the arena for one of the most dramatic battles of the First World War. If one looks at a map of Poland from the early 20th century, Lodz stands out as a particular point of attraction for steel railways. This city, which grew from a small settlement into a large industrial center, became the true logistical heart of the region. It was no coincidence that Lodz was called the Polish Manchester. By the beginning of World War I, over 500 textile enterprises operated here, supplying products not only to the Russian Empire, but also to foreign markets. The history of Łódź's railway network began in 1866, when the city was connected to Warsaw and Kalisz. This line, known as the Warsaw-Kalisz Railway, became the first artery linking the industrial center with the rest of the empire. This was followed by the Lodz Factory Railway and a branch line to Kalushki, which transformed the city into a key transport hub of the Vistula land. For the Russian Empire, these railways had a dual significance. In peacetime, they ensured economic prosperity, allowing raw materials to be delivered to Lodz factories and finished products to be exported. In wartime, the same rails became a strategic resource for moving troops and supplies to the western border. The problem was that the Russian railway network differed significantly from the European one. The difference in track gauge made it impossible to use rolling stock directly. At the border, all goods had to be transshipped and passengers transferred. This feature, originally conceived as a defensive measure against a potential invasion, in reality created serious logistical difficulties for the Russian army. The German command fully understood the importance of Lodz as a transport hub. Control over the city meant control over the movement of Russian troops and cargo in western Poland. Moreover, the capture of the railway infrastructure allowed the Germans to quickly redeploy their units along the front line, creating a numerical advantage in key directions. Lodz was not just an industrial city. It represented a complex system of railway stations, depots, workshops, and warehouses. Tracks from different directions converged here, making the city an ideal distribution center. Whoever controlled Lodz could effectively manage logistics across a significant part of Poland. For Russia's mobilization capabilities, the railways of Lodz were critically important. Trains carrying reinforcements, ammunition, food, and medical supplies traveled along them. Any disruption in this system immediately affected the combat effectiveness of the troops, and Russian logistics were already suffering from a shortage of rolling stock and limited line capacity. German intelligence carefully studied the region's railway network. Special agents collected information on train schedules, station capacity, and the location of repair workshops. This data allowed them to plan not only the capture, but also the subsequent use of the transport infrastructure. On the eve of the Lodz operation, the Russian command actively used the railways to regroup forces. According to eyewitness accounts, Lodz railway stations resembled anthills. Military echelons arrived and departed day and night. The city became a huge transit point through which endless streams of people and goods passed. Local residents were accustomed to the constant movement of troops. Polish railway workers toiled at their limit, ensuring uninterrupted transport operations. At the same time, their position was ambiguous. Formally, they served the Russian Empire, but many sympathized with the idea of an independent Poland. This duality reflected the complex situation of the Polish people caught between warring powers. In early November 1914, the Lodz railway network was operating at maximum capacity. The Russian command did not suspect that the Germans had already prepared a surprise that would fundamentally change the situation at the front. Secretly redeploying their units along the railways of East Prussia and Silesia, the enemy was preparing to strike where it was least expected. German General August von Mackensen leaned over maps in his headquarters near Thorn. His gaze was fixed on the lines of the Russian front stretching across Polish territory. The commander of the 9th Army saw what had escaped the attention of the Russian command: a vulnerable gap between the 1st and 2nd Russian armies, gaping like an invitation to attack. The plan, developed by Mackensen in conjunction with Ludendorff, was daring to the point of recklessness: to deliver a sudden flank attack on the right wing of the Russian forces, break through to Lodz, and cut off significant enemy forces from their main communications. The Germans relied on two key factors: stealth and speed. In late October 1914, a meticulously disguised regrouping of German troops began. 5 army corps, almost 150,000 soldiers with artillery, moved stealthily to their starting positions. Germany's railway network operated like a flawless mechanism. Trains ran one after another, adhering to a strict timetable. For camouflage, transportation was carried out mainly at night, with blackout measures observed. Intelligence services played a key role in preparing the operation. German agents gathered information on the deployment of Russian troops, road conditions, and weather. Simultaneously, a large-scale disinformation campaign was conducted. Articles about troop transfers to the Western Front were published in the German press. Rumors spread about preparations for an offensive in the Krakow area. To enhance the effect of disinformation, the Germans simulated activity in other sectors of the front. Demonstrative movements of small units were carried out, and false radio communications were arranged. Russian intelligence recorded these actions but could not determine the direction of the main thrust. Mackensen personally oversaw the preparation of the operation, paying particular attention to artillery. He understood that the success of the breakthrough largely depended on firepower. Under his command, more than 700 guns of various calibers were concentrated. Ammunition was delivered in a continuous stream. German soldiers prepared for the offensive with their characteristic, methodical approach. Officers reconnoitered the terrain, studied maps, and planned routes of movement. Each battalion received a specific task and clear instructions. Special attention was paid to the interaction of infantry and artillery. The Russian command, meanwhile, was preoccupied with its own plans for an offensive into Silesia. Intelligence reported some enemy movements, but these signals did not form a complete picture. Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich and his staff did not expect serious German activity after their recent retreat from Warsaw. The morning of November 11, 1914, dawned. A damp fog enveloped the positions of the Russian troops. At 8 o'clock in the morning, German artillery opened hurricane fire on the forward lines of the 2nd Russian Army. Hundreds of guns rained tons of shells on trenches and dugouts. The earth trembled, the air filled with thunder and smoke. After a 2-hour artillery preparation, the German infantry went on the attack. Dense lines of soldiers in gray greatcoats moved forward, overcoming mud and destroyed fortifications. Russian units offered fierce resistance, but the enemy's superiority in artillery was increasingly evident. By the evening of the first day of the offensive, the Germans had broken through the Russian defense on a sector approximately 20 kilometers wide and advanced up to 10 kilometers deep. Mackensen personally arrived at the front line to assess the situation. What he saw encouraged him. The plan had begun to work. The Russian command belatedly realized the scale of the threat. General Scheidemann, commander of the Second Army, requested reinforcements and tried to organize counterattacks. But the Germans were already developing their success, penetrating deeper and deeper into the Russian positions. On November 12th, the offensive continued with increasing force. German cavalry bypassed pockets of resistance, reaching open ground. The infantry methodically occupied village after village, relentlessly advancing towards Lodz. Russian units retreated, trying to organize a new line of defense. A nervous atmosphere reigned at the headquarters of the Northwestern Front. The front commander, General Ruzsky, urgently transferred reserves to the threatened sector. But the railways operated intermittently, and troops arrived piecemeal and were committed to battle in parts. By the end of the third day of the offensive, the advanced units of the 9th German Army had advanced 40 kilometers. Mackensen's flank attack was turning into a deep breakthrough, threatening to encircle significant forces of the Russian army. The German plan for a sudden strike worked brilliantly, creating the prerequisites for decisive success in the Battle of Lodz. By early November 1914, the Russian 2nd and 5th Armies represented a whimsical blend of the brilliance and destitution of the imperial war machine. Stationed on Polish territory, they became the living embodiment of all the strengths and weaknesses of the Russian mobilization system. The Second Army, under the command of General Scheidemann, comprised approximately 120,000 men and occupied positions north of Lodz. General Plehve's Fifth Army, of roughly the same strength, was positioned to the south. Between them yawned a dangerous gap, which headquarters deemed insignificant. After all, the Germans were retreating after the Warsaw-Ivangorod operation. The composition of these armies reflected the empire's diverse nature. Here were Siberian riflemen and Don Cossacks, grenadiers from central provinces, and militiamen called up just a month prior. Regular units coexisted with hastily formed reserve divisions. The combat experience of the first months of the war had already taught soldiers to dig in and conserve ammunition. But many newly arrived reinforcements had yet to smell powder. The main problem for the Russian troops was logistics. Railways operated intermittently. There was a shortage of locomotives and wagons. Shells and cartridges were delivered with delays. Artillery batteries received strict instructions to economize ammunition. "No more than 25 shells per gun per day," read one order, while German batteries could fire hundreds of shells. The communication system between units left much to be desired. Telephone lines were often damaged, and field telegraphs worked intermittently. Commanders had to rely on mounted orderlies, which critically slowed down the transmission of orders. In the conditions of maneuver warfare, this became a fatal flaw. General Scheidemann, commander of the Second Army, was aware of the vulnerability of his positions, but was bound by the directives of the front headquarters. The 50-year-old general with graying whiskers had a reputation as a cautious tactician. Already in early November, he reported suspicious enemy activity, but his reports did not elicit an adequate response. "Reconnaissance is recording the movement of large enemy forces in the Thorn area," Scheidemann wrote to front headquarters on November lim. The answer was discouraging. "Continue observation. The enemy is likely regrouping before withdrawing to winter quarters." General Plehve, commander of the Fifth Army, was in a similar position. An experienced cavalryman, a participant in the Russo-Turkish War, he instinctively sensed the impending danger. His mounted patrols reported strange movements in the German rear, but concrete data was lacking. When, on the morning of November 11, 1914, German artillery opened a hurricane fire on the positions of the Second Army, it came as a shock to the Russian command. Scheidemann immediately understood the scale of the threat. The enemy has launched a general offensive with large forces, he telegraphed to front headquarters. The first hours of the German offensive revealed all the weaknesses of the Russian command system. Orders were delayed, reserves were transferred slowly. Individual regiments and divisions fought virtually independently without coordination with their neighbors. The bravery of the soldiers compensated for the shortcomings of command, but could not stop the methodical German onslaught. By the evening of the first day of the offensive, it became clear that the Germans had broken through the front of the Second Army. Scheidemann tried to organize counterattacks, but fragmented strikes could not stop the advancing German columns. His reports to headquarters became increasingly alarming. The enemy, with superior forces, has broken through the center of the army. I request urgent reinforcements. General Plehve, upon receiving news of the breakthrough from his neighbors, began hastily transferring units north, trying to cover the gap that had formed. But his troops moved along roads muddied by autumn rains, while the Germans used a network of highways and railway lines. The Russian mobilization system, designed for the methodical deployment of the army according to pre-established plans, proved unprepared for improvisation. Reserves existed, but their transfer required time. Ammunition was available in warehouses, but its delivery to the front line turned into an extremely complex logistical task. By the end of the third day of the offensive, the situation became critical. The German wedge was driven deeper between the Second and Fifth Armies, threatening to encircle both. The Russian command finally realized the scale of the catastrophe. A race against time began. Would the Russians manage to transfer enough forces to stop the German offensive before Lodz was cut off from main communications? November 17th became a turning point in the Battle of Lodz. The German offensive wedge, deeply embedded between the Russian armies, was clearly marked on the battle map. But what seemed like a triumph of German arms suddenly turned into a trap. General Schäfer's corps, forming the spearhead of the German offensive, advanced too far and found itself encircled. On the morning of the 17th, General Ruzsky, commander of the Northwestern Front, made a bold decision. Instead of continuing the retreat, he ordered General Plehve's Fifth Army to counterattack from the south and units of the First and Second Armies from the north and east. The ring around Schäfer's corps began to rapidly tighten. Quote, "Zero," wrote German officer Hans Müller in his diary. Quote, "The encircled group comprised the 25th Reserve Corps, the 3rd Guards Division, and the 1st Cavalry Division, about 60,000 men with 200 guns. These troops, who had been confidently advancing just yesterday, now found themselves in a critical situation. Ammunition was running out, food supplies remained for 3 days, and the wounded filled makeshift hospitals. General Schäfer, an experienced Prussian military leader, remained calm. Gathering his unit commanders, he announced, the German officers met his words with silent approval. No one entertained the thought of capitulation. Meanwhile, the Russian command tightened the encirclement. General Plehve personally directed the actions of his troops, moving units to threatened sectors. He demanded of his subordinates. Cossack patrols continuously conducted reconnaissance, reporting on enemy movements. On November 19th, Schäfer began preparations for the breakthrough. All unnecessary equipment was destroyed. The wounded were placed on carts, and light guns were distributed among the columns. Heavy artillery had to be abandoned after being rendered inoperable. The corps order read, on the night of November 20th, the Germans launched their breakthrough. Choosing the direction of Brzezinyi, where the encirclement ring was thinnest, Schäfer threw all his forces at a narrow section of the front. German infantry attacked in dense columns, disregarding losses. Artillery fired its last shells supporting the attack. Russian units holding positions near Brzezinyi offered fierce resistance. Siberian riflemen and grenadiers fought to the death, understanding the importance of the moment. But the concentration of German forces on a narrow sector yielded results. By dawn on November 20th, advanced German units had broken through the encirclement. This news spread like wildfire through the German columns. Through the corridor, only a few kilometers wide, endless convoys of wounded, artillery, and infantry units streamed. Russian artillery shelled the corridor, but could not completely close it. General Plehve, receiving news of the breakthrough, immediately launched a counterattack with reserves. He demanded, but it was too late. The main forces of Schäfer's corps had already escaped the encirclement, albeit suffering heavy losses. Rearguard units continued to hold back Russian counterattacks, covering the retreat of the main forces. By the evening of November 20th, it became clear that Schäfer had achieved the almost impossible: to withdraw the main part of his troops from encirclement. This was an undeniable tactical success for the Germans, marred, however, by the strategic failure of the entire operation. The breakthrough to Lodz had faltered. The plan to encircle the Russian armies had failed. General Mackensen, receiving the report of Schäfer's corps breaking out of encirclement, experienced mixed feelings. On the one hand, a catastrophe had been avoided and significant forces preserved. On the other, the original plan of the operation had not been realized. He reported to the Stavka. For the Russian command, Schäfer's breakthrough was a bitter lesson. The encirclement ring proved insufficiently strong, and coordination between the armies imperfect. We missed the opportunity to destroy a significant part of the German forces, General Ruzsky regretfully admitted in his report to the Supreme Commander-in-Chief. The dramatic events of November 17th-20th became the climax of the Battle of Lodz. Both sides demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of their armies. The Germans showed an ability for bold maneuvers and organized actions in critical situations. Russian troops displayed steadfastness in defense and an ability for counterattacks, but failed to complete the encirclement of the enemy. This episode of the battle clearly demonstrated the features of a new type of war: maneuverable actions of large masses of troops, swift breakthroughs and encirclements, and the importance of communications and supply. The Lodz operation became a school of modern warfare for both sides, delivering harsh but necessary lessons. When the cannons roared at the approaches to Lodz, a true tragedy began for the peaceful inhabitants of this industrial city. In the autumn of 1914, Lodz had over 500,000 residents: Poles, Jews, Germans, and Russians. The second largest city of the Russian Empire in Poland suddenly found itself at the epicenter of one of the bloodiest battles of the early First World War. The first artillery salvos caught the townspeople off guard. We heard a distant rumble, which grew louder and louder. Children clung to their mothers in fear, and in the eyes of the adults, there was a silent question: what awaits us? Stanislav Kowalski, owner of a small textile workshop on the outskirts of the city, later recalled. In mid-November, German troops approached the suburbs of Lodz. The city authorities, appointed by the Russian administration, were unprepared for the evacuation of such a large number of people. The railway station turned into a place of chaos and despair. Thousands of people stormed the rare trains departing eastward. Many carried only what they could grab at the last moment. On the platform stood a woman with 3 small children and 1 bundle. She did not cry, but in her eyes such grief was frozen that it became unbearable to look, wrote city doctor Jakub Weinberg in his diary, who remained in the city until the end to help the wounded. Those who could not leave, and they were the majority, sought refuge in basements and improvised shelters. City churches, Catholic churches, Orthodox churches, synagogues, turned into overcrowded refuges. People of different faiths prayed side by side, united by a common misfortune. On November 18, 1914, street fighting began. Russian troops tried to hold the city, using factory buildings as strongholds. The Germans methodically advanced, using artillery to destroy fortified positions. Civilians found themselves caught between two fires. Our house was on the front line. Russian soldiers occupied the upper floors, ordering us to go down to the basement. All night, gunshots thundered overhead. The walls shook from shell explosions. We sat, huddled together, and prayed for salvation, recalled Helena Dubrovska, who was only 14 at the time. The urban infrastructure rapidly deteriorated. The water supply was damaged in several places, and the power plant stopped due to a lack of coal. The onset of cold weather exacerbated people's suffering. Pharmacies ran out of medicines, and bakeries ran out of flour. Famine began. The numerous Jewish community of Lodz, which comprised almost a third of the city's population, suffered particularly severely. Traditionally engaged in trade and crafts, many Jewish families lost all sources of income. We ate once a day, a little potato and bread if we could find it. Children cried from hunger, and we, the adults, gave them our portions, recorded Rabbi Mordecai Levin in his diary. By the end of November, a catastrophic sanitary situation arose in the city. The bodies of the dead sometimes lay in the streets for several days, as there was no one and nowhere to bury them. City hospitals were overflowing with wounded, both military and civilian. Doctors worked around the clock, without rest and sufficient medication. I operated by candlelight, using ordinary carpentry tools when surgical kits ran out. Anesthesia ran out on the third day. We gave patients vodka if available, or simply asked them to endure the pain. Many died not from wounds, but from blood poisoning, recalled Dr. Antony Kowalczyk, a surgeon at the city hospital. On December 6th, Russian troops left Lodz. The retreat was organized, but for the remaining inhabitants, this meant new trials. German troops, who entered the city, established a harsh occupation regime. A curfew was introduced, violation of which was punishable by execution. All food was subject to accounting and distributed by ration cards. German soldiers went from house to house, taking everything valuable, from food to copper utensils. Resistance was pointless and dangerous. We gave away our last possessions just to save our lives, wrote Maria Wisniewska, a teacher at the city gymnasium, in a letter to relatives. The Battle of Lodz became a symbol of national tragedy for the Polish people. Poles, who did not have their own state and were divided among three empires, again became victims of someone else's war. Men of conscription age served in the armies of opposing sides, often fighting against each other. My brother Tadeusz was mobilized into the Russian army, and my cousin Jerzy into the German army. We did not know if they were alive, and we prayed that they would not meet on the battlefield, recalled Zofia Majowska, a textile factory worker. In Polish national memory, the Battle of Lodz remains one of the most tragic pages of history. The city, which was a symbol of industrial progress and the peaceful coexistence of different cultures, became an arena of bloody battles. Tens of thousands of civilians became victims of a war that had no meaning for them. The Battle of Lodz became a true laboratory of combat techniques and technical means of the early 20th century. Here, on Polish soil, old tactical doctrines clashed with the reality of modern warfare, and new types of weapons underwent their baptism of fire on an unprecedented scale. Artillery established itself as the god of war. The German army concentrated over 700 guns of various calibers near Lodz, from light field guns to heavy howitzers. German artillerymen employed the creeping barrage method, where shells were successively shifted deeper into the enemy's defenses, paving the way for advancing infantry, recalled German artillery officer Wilhelm Brenner. Russian artillery was inferior to German in terms of the number of guns and ammunition, but compensated for this with accuracy of fire. Russian batteries skillfully camouflaged themselves, frequently changed positions, and delivered unexpected strikes against concentrations of German troops. The 3-inch field guns of the 1902 model, known for their high rate of fire, proved particularly effective, wrote General Pleve in his memoirs. The Battle of Lodz was marked by the widespread use of machine guns. German units were armed with machine guns, which were mounted on special carriages and provided dense defensive fire. The Russian army also actively used machine guns, though in smaller numbers, noted Russian officer Nikolai Voronov in his diary. For the first time in the history of the Eastern Front, aviation was actively used in the Battle of Lodz. German and type aircraft conducted regular reconnaissance flights over Russian troop positions. Pilots photographed troop dispositions, located artillery batteries, transmitted information via radio, or dropped reports in special containers, recalled Russian infantryman Ivan Semyonov. Russian aviation, though inferior to German in quantity and quality of aircraft, also performed reconnaissance tasks. Pilots of Sikorsky and Russian-made aircraft undertook risky flights over German positions, gathering valuable intelligence about enemy movements, wrote observer pilot Lieutenant Alexander Kovanko in a report. The aircraft was constantly under fire from the ground. We had to fly at maximum altitude, where the cold cut to the bone, and the thin air made breathing difficult. During the Battle of Lodz, both sides experimented with new tactical approaches. The Germans used infiltration tactics, the penetration of small groups through enemy battle formations, followed by an attack from the rear. Russian forces responded by creating circular defenses and mobile reserves to eliminate breakthroughs. War ceased to be linear, noted General Scheidemann in his report. The front turned into a space where the enemy could appear from any side. Soldiers had to be taught to act independently, to make decisions on the spot, without waiting for orders. Cavalry played a special role in the battle. Contrary to the widespread belief in its obsolescence, mounted units were actively used by both sides, but their role changed. Instead of classic cavalry charges, cavalrymen acted as mobile infantry, dismounting for battle and using horses for rapid movement. Our dragoons became versatile soldiers, wrote Cavalry Regiment Commander Colonel Brusilov, a namesake of the famous general. In the morning, they could conduct reconnaissance 20 versts from the main forces. During the day, dismounted, hold a key defensive sector, and in the evening, raid the enemy's rear. The Battle of Lodz demonstrated the first signs of a transition from maneuver warfare to positional warfare. By the end of November, continuous lines of trenches, reinforced with barbed wire and machine gun positions, appeared in certain sectors of the front. Attacks on such positions led to heavy losses and rarely ended in success. "We attacked the same hill 3 times in a day," recalled German Lieutenant Max Hoffmann. "Each time we managed to reach the wire, but further advance was impossible. Machine guns mowed down entire platoons. By evening, less than half of the company remained." An important lesson from the battle was the need for close interaction between different branches of service. Success was achieved by commanders who could coordinate the actions of infantry, artillery, and cavalry. The concept of combined arms combat was emerging, which became the basis of military doctrine for subsequent decades. "Modern battle requires an orchestral performance," General Mackinson figuratively expressed in a conversation with staff officers. "Every instrument is important, but they must play according to a single score under the direction of one conductor. The Battle of Lodz became a kind of testing ground where new methods of warfare were tried out. The experience gained here influenced the tactics and strategy of both sides in subsequent years. Russia accelerated the production of artillery shells and machine guns. Germany improved the system of interaction between infantry and artillery. Warfare became increasingly technological, requiring military leaders to adopt new approaches to organizing combat operations. December 6, 1914, became a turning point in the history of the Battle of Lodz. In the early frosty morning, Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich, Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the Russian Army, signed the order to abandon Lodz. This decision was not easy for him. Retreating is always harder than advancing, especially when it comes to a large industrial center. But military necessity dictated its terms. Already the day before, alarming reports had been received at the headquarters of the Northwestern Front. The Germans were bringing up fresh forces, transferring them by rail through Silesia. Reconnaissance reported the concentration of a large enemy artillery grouping northwest of Lodz. It became obvious that the German command was preparing a new, powerful strike. Holding Lodz in the current situation will require disproportionately large sacrifices, General Ruzsky wrote in his report. The salient formed as a result of the fighting is vulnerable to flank attacks. It is more expedient to withdraw troops to more favorable lines along the Rauka and Bezura rivers. The Grand Duke, having carefully studied the map and listened to the opinions of the army commanders, agreed with this assessment. Holding Lodz meant risking the encirclement of significant forces. Retreating to pre-prepared positions allowed the front to be straightened, and its length reduced by almost a third. The order to retreat provided for a phased withdrawal of troops, starting with the most advanced units. Special attention was paid to the evacuation of the wounded, military property, and strategically important equipment from Lodz factories. The railway worked to its limit. Trains departed one after another, carrying everything that could be useful to the enemy to the east. General Scheidemann personally supervised the withdrawal of the Second Army. "Retreat is not defeat if it is organized correctly," he told the officers. "We are preserving manpower for future battles. The main thing is to prevent panic and disorder." The Russian troops left Lodz in an organized manner according to a pre-developed plan. Rearguard units occupied defensive positions on the outskirts of the city, covering the retreat of the main forces. Sappers prepared bridges and railway junctions for demolition. Everything that could not be evacuated but could be useful to the enemy was destroyed. The evacuation of hospitals presented particular difficulty. Thousands of wounded needed to be transported to the rear without subjecting them to additional suffering. "We worked day and night without rest," recalled nurse Elizaveta Morozova. The wounded were placed in freight cars, with straw laid on the floor. Doctors traveled with them, performing necessary procedures right on the way. For the local population, the retreat of Russian troops meant new trials. Many Poles, especially those who collaborated with the Russian administration, feared reprisals from the Germans. Thousands of people tried to leave with the retreating army, joining columns of refugees on the snow-covered roads. "I saw an old man who was dragging all his belongings on a sled," wrote Sergei Mamontov, an officer of the Preobrazhensky regiment, in his diary. Next to him walked his wife, leaning on a stick. They did not say a word, they just walked forward, as if they no longer belonged to this world. The German command did not immediately realize the scale of the Russian retreat. Fearing a trap, General Mackensen ordered his troops to advance with extreme caution. Advanced German units entered Lodz only by the evening of December 6th, when the main Russian forces had already withdrawn to the east. The strategic retreat of Russian troops fundamentally changed the configuration of the Eastern Front. The line of confrontation straightened, now running along the Bzura, Raka, and Pilitsa rivers. The Russian command gained the opportunity to regroup forces, bring up reserves, and establish supply. The Germans, although they occupied an important industrial center, could not achieve their main goal, the encirclement and destruction of significant enemy forces. Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich, in a telegram to Emperor Nicholas II, assessed the results of the operation as follows. The troops of the Northwestern Front, having withstood the onslaught of superior enemy forces, withdrew in an organized manner to new positions. Losses are significant, but the combat capability of the armies has been preserved. The morale of the troops remains high. We are preparing for further actions. The German command, despite the capture of Lodz, had mixed feelings. The city was taken, but at the cost of huge losses. The strategic plan of the operation, the encirclement of the Russian armies, was not realized. General Ludendorff later admitted in his memoirs, "We achieved a tactical success, but we could not achieve a decisive victory. The Russians avoided encirclement thanks to a timely retreat." For the further course of the campaign on the Eastern Front, the retreat from Lodz had twofold consequences. On the one hand, the Russian army lost an important industrial center and was forced to retreat to the east. On the other hand, this maneuver allowed it to avoid a potential catastrophe and preserve its main forces. The front stabilized on new lines, where it held until the summer of the following year. After the completion of the Lodz operation, the German command conducted a thorough analysis of all aspects of the battle. For German generals, this was an opportunity to draw valuable lessons from the first large-scale engagement on the Eastern Front. Despite the tactical success, the capture of Lodz, the strategic intent of encircling and destroying significant Russian forces was not fully realized. This required a serious understanding of the reasons for both successes and failures. The first and most important conclusion concerned the role of intelligence. The initial phase of the operation was successful precisely due to the excellent work of the German intelligence service. The hidden regrouping of Mackensen's 9th Army became possible thanks to accurate data on the disposition of Russian troops, and especially on the gap between the 1st and 2nd Russian armies. Quote, noted General Ludendorff in his report, German intelligence used all available means, from traditional cavalry patrols to the latest technical equipment. Aerial reconnaissance proved particularly effective. German airplanes daily flew over Russian troop positions, photographing the deployment of units and recording the movements of reserves. Quote, wrote Colonel Hoffmann, head of the intelligence department of the Eastern Front staff, in his notes. An equally important element of intelligence was the radio interception service. The Germans successfully intercepted and deciphered Russian radio messages, obtaining valuable information about enemy plans. The Russian command, underestimating the capabilities of technical intelligence, often transmitted orders in plain text, which gave the Germans a significant informational advantage. The second key conclusion concerned the factor of surprise. German strategists realized its decisive role in modern warfare. The sudden strike of the 9th Army on the flank of Russian troops initially led to brilliant success precisely because the enemy did not expect an offensive in this direction. Quote noted General Mackensen, to achieve surprise, the German command developed a whole complex of measures. Troops were transferred at night, observing the strictest discipline of march and light camouflage. Artillery was moved into position at the last moment. Radio communication between units was minimized or coded with particular care. Special attention was paid to enemy disinformation. false information about the direction of the main attack was spread, and demonstrative movements of small units were carried out in secondary sectors of the front. All this made it possible to conceal true intentions and achieve tactical surprise. The third important lesson concerned the interaction of various branches of service. The Lodz operation showed that the success of modern combat depends on the coordinated work of infantry, artillery, cavalry, and new technical means. The German command noted the need for further improvement of the troop control system. General Mackensen figuratively expressed in a conversation with staff officers, "The interaction of infantry and artillery proved particularly important. German artillerymen developed the method of the creeping barrage, where fire was successively transferred deep into the enemy's defenses, paving the way for advancing infantry. This technique proved highly effective in breaking through Russian defenses at the beginning of the operation." The fourth conclusion concerned the assessment of the enemy. The Battle of Lodz forced the German command to reconsider its attitude towards the Russian army. Despite the defeat in East Prussia at the beginning of the war, Russian troops showed the ability to quickly recover and launch effective counterattacks. The Russian soldier showed exceptional resilience and endurance, noted General von Morgan in his report. His ability to endure hardships and the rigors of the winter campaign is particularly impressive. Our calculations for the rapid demoralization of the Russian army proved to be erroneous. German analysts also noted the enemy's weaknesses: insufficient flexibility of the higher command, problems with supplies, especially artillery ammunition, and inefficient work of rear services. These observations formed the basis for planning future operations. The fifth lesson concerned the importance of railways in modern warfare. The Lodz operation clearly demonstrated that control over transport communications is crucial for the success of large-scale operations. The German command concluded that it was necessary to further develop railway troops and improve the system of military transportation. Quote, wrote Colonel Groner, who was responsible for railway transportation, in his analysis of the operation. The sixth conclusion concerned the re-evaluation of the significance of the Eastern Front in the overall strategy of the war. Prior to the Lodz operation, the German command considered it a secondary theater of operations, prioritizing the Western Front. Now it became evident that underestimating the Russian threat could have serious consequences, noted General Falkenhayn, chief of the German General Staff. This re-evaluation led to an adjustment of the overall strategy. The German command realized the need to wage war on two fronts with equal attention to both. This meant a more even distribution of resources, reinforcements, and military equipment between the Western and Eastern fronts. The lessons of the Battle of Lodz had a significant impact on subsequent German military doctrine. The experience gained in this operation was meticulously studied and systematized. Based on it, new tactical techniques were developed, troop control methods were improved, and the principles of interaction between different branches of service were revised. Particularly important was the experience of breaking through the enemy's front in a narrow sector, with subsequent development of success in depth and towards the flanks. This technique, first applied on a large scale near Lodz, became the prototype of the tactics of infiltration and storm troops, widely used in subsequent years of the war. Overall, the Battle of Lodz became a valuable source of combat experience for the German command. The lessons learned allowed for the improvement of the strategy and tactics of warfare on the Eastern Front, which ultimately led to serious successes of the German army in the campaign of 1915. The value of intelligence and the factor of surprise, so vividly demonstrated in the Lodz operation, became cornerstones of German military doctrine for all subsequent years of the First World War. The Battle of Lodz mercilessly exposed all the weaknesses of the Russian military system. Like a surgeon's scalpel, it laid bare long-standing problems that, in peacetime, were masked by parades and bravura reports. Now, with the fate of entire armies at stake, these shortcomings became strikingly apparent. The first and most serious failure was the catastrophic lack of coordination between fronts and armies. General Ruski, commander of the Northwestern Front, and his staff were located in Siedlce, hundreds of kilometers from the battleground. Orders traveled down a long chain of command, losing relevance by the time they reached the executors. General Scheidemann noted bitterly in his diary. The coordination problems were particularly evident during the critical days of the German breakthrough. When Mackensen's 9th German Army struck between the 1st and 2nd Russian armies, precious time was lost organizing countermeasures. Headquarters exchanged telegrams, clarified the situation, and coordinated plans, while the Germans advanced rapidly. The communication system proved utterly inadequate for the demands of maneuver warfare. Telephone lines were constantly damaged by artillery fire, and their restoration took hours. Radio stations were a rarity, even at the corps level. Commanders had to rely on mounted orderlies, who could take hours to reach their destination along mud-soaked roads. During a day of battle, I sent 12 orderlies with dispatches to the divisional headquarters, recalled Colonel Nestorov, commander of an infantry regiment. Only 7 returned. The rest either got lost, came under fire, or were intercepted by German patrols. Even more dismal was the situation with supplies. The Russian Empire, possessing colossal resources, failed to organize their delivery to the front. The reason lay in an archaic logistics system not designed for the scale of modern warfare. Railways, the main arteries of supply, operated intermittently. There was a shortage of rolling stock, locomotives, and wagons. Bottlenecks on overloaded lines created congestion. Stations couldn't cope with the flow of goods. Moreover, the different track gauges of Russian and European railways required all materials to be reloaded at the border, creating additional delays. At Skierniewice station, I observed mountains of boxes of cartridges and shells lying in the open air, wrote an officer of the quartermaster service in his report. Trains with reinforcements stood nearby. But there wasn't a single locomotive to deliver all this to the front lines, 20 versts away, where the battle was raging. Artillery batteries particularly suffered from supply disruptions. Russian guns often fell silent, not because they were damaged, but due to a lack of shells. Commanders were forced to impose strict limits on ammunition expenditure, no more than 20 to 30 rounds per gun per day. In comparison, German batteries could fire hundreds of shells daily. We were forced to conserve every shell, recalled Captain Vorontsov, commander of an artillery battery. We only fired at concentrations of infantry, or when there was an immediate threat of a breakthrough. It was agonizing to see German columns within range and be unable to open fire. Transportation problems were exacerbated by the condition of the roads. Autumn mud turned dirt tracks into an impassable quagmire. Horse-drawn carts, the main means of delivering goods from railway stations to the front, got stuck in the mud. Horses were exhausted trying to pull overloaded wagons. The road from Rawa to the front line turned into a continuous swamp, reported the head of logistics for the 5th Army. 2 horse carts get stuck every 100 steps. We have to hitch 4 to 6 horses or unload part of the cargo. Delivery time has tripled. All these problems inevitably affected troop morale. Soldiers, not receiving food, ammunition, and warm uniforms on time, began to lose faith in the command. Officers, having no communication with higher headquarters, felt abandoned. A dangerous sense of chaos and helplessness arose in the face of a well-organized enemy. "Our soldiers fought heroically," General Pleve wrote in his memoirs, "but even the bravest warrior cannot fight long on an empty stomach and without cartridges. We demanded the impossible from people, and they accomplished the impossible, but at what cost?" The Battle of Lodz was a harsh lesson for the Russian military leadership. It became clear that without a radical reform of the command and supply system, it would be impossible to successfully counter such an organized enemy as the German army. Already in December 1914, the first transformations began. Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich initiated the creation of a special commission to study the experience of the Lodz operation. Its findings were disheartening but constructive. The commission recommended decentralizing the command system, granting army commanders more autonomy in decision-making. It was proposed to create mobile reserves at the front level, capable of quickly responding to enemy breakthroughs. Particular attention was paid to reforming the supply system. A Special Executive Commission for Artillery was created under the chairmanship of General Manikovsky, tasked with solving the problem of shell hunger. The construction of new military factories began. Existing productions were expanded, and private industry was enlisted to fulfill military orders. In the area of transportation, priority was given to expanding the capacity of railways leading to the front. Additional sidings and loading platforms were built, and the fleet of locomotives and wagons was increased. Special road construction battalions were formed to improve the condition of dirt roads. The communication system also underwent modernization. Supplies of field telephones and cable increased, mobile radio stations were created, and codes were improved to protect messages from interception. These measures, though belated, significantly improved the combat effectiveness of the Russian army by the spring of 1915. The Battle of Lodz, for all its drama, became a catalyst for necessary changes. The Russian war machine slowly but surely adapted to the demands of modern warfare. The Battle of Lodz holds a special place in the historical memory of three nations whose destinies intertwined on its battlefields. For Russia, Germany, and Poland, these events were not merely an episode of the First World War, but a symbol reflecting national identity, military traditions, and historical traumas. More than a century after those bloody battles, historians from the three countries continue to re-evaluate the significance of this battle, uncovering new facets and details of a forgotten conflict. In Russian historical memory, the Lodz operation long remained in the shadow of other First World War events. Soviet historiography, focused on revolutionary events, paid little attention to the imperialist war. Only in the post-Soviet period did historians begin to rediscover the significance of this battle for Russian military history. The Lodz operation showcased both the strengths and weaknesses of the Russian army, notes contemporary Russian historian Alexei Oleynikov. On the one hand, the resilience of the soldiers and the tactical skill of individual commanders. On the other, problems in the command and supply system, which later played a fatal role in the empire's destiny. In modern Russian history textbooks, the Battle of Lodz is mentioned as an example of a successful strategic retreat that prevented the encirclement of large forces. Emphasis is placed on the Russian command's ability to adapt to changing circumstances and learn from defeats. In Russia's museum exhibitions dedicated to the First World War, the Lodz operation is presented through the personal stories of the battle's participants. Soldiers' letters, officers' diaries, photographs of field hospitals. This allows visitors to see the human dimension of war, extending beyond dry figures and diagrams. For German historical scholarship, the Battle of Lodz has always been of significant interest. In the interwar period, it was considered an example of successful maneuvering of large forces and the application of the principle of surprise. German military theorists studied General Mackensen's experience in detail, drawing lessons for future conflicts. The operation near Lodz became a kind of laboratory for tactical methods that were later refined and applied in the Second World War, writes contemporary German historian Holger Herwig. The concept of a deep breakthrough followed by the encirclement of the enemy, first tested here, later transformed into the Blitzkrieg doctrine. In post-war Germany, especially after the country's reunification in the 1990s, the assessment of the Battle of Lodz became more balanced. Modern German historians emphasize not only tactical successes, but also strategic miscalculations of the command, as well as the enormous human casualties suffered by all sides of the conflict. In German military history museums, the Lodz operation is presented through the prism of technological innovations, the use of aviation for reconnaissance, the development of artillery tactics, and the improvement of field communications. The exhibitions demonstrate how war became increasingly mechanized, foreshadowing future conflicts. But the Battle of Lodz left the deepest mark on the historical memory of the Polish people. For Poles, these events symbolize the tragedy of a divided nation, forced to fight in the armies of warring empires. Polish soldiers in Russian and German uniforms shot at each other, defending foreign interests on their native soil. The Battle of Lodz is a symbol of national tragedy, says Polish historian Andrzej Chwalba. The city, which was a center of industrial development and peaceful coexistence of different cultures, turned into an arena of bloody battle. For us, it is not just a military operation, but part of a complex path to independence through suffering. In modern Poland, the memory of the Battle of Lodz is carefully preserved. Memorials have been erected at the battle sites, and permanent exhibitions dedicated to these events have been created in city museums. Special attention is paid to the fate of the civilian population caught between the hammer and anvil of war. For military historians of all three countries, the Lodz operation remains a valuable source of experience. Modern analysts study it as an example of maneuver warfare that preceded the transition to positional battles. Of particular interest are issues of coordinating large troop formations, organizing supplies, and using the railway network for strategic transfers. Today, when relations between Russia, Germany, and Poland are going through difficult times, the shared historical memory of the Battle of Lodz can serve as a reminder of the tragic consequences of conflicts and the importance of peaceful coexistence. The lessons of the past are more relevant than ever, and studying forgotten pages of history helps us better understand the present and foresee the future.